The prayer circle closed around me like a noose. 23 pairs of eyes, heads bowed in manufactured sympathy, voices rising in harmonious pity as Sister Margaret led the congregation in what she called urgent intercession for my family's dire circumstances. I stood there in my second-hand dress, clutching my worn purse, listening to them plead with the Almighty to deliver us from our poverty, to bless us with abundance, to lift us from the depths of financial despair. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. What they didn't know, what none of them could have imagined as they prayed so fervently for my poor family, was that I had been quietly building an empire while they built their assumptions. Hidden beneath their charitable concerns and whispered gossip was a woman who had spent 15 years turning their pity into power, their dismissal into determination, and their prayers into the very prophecy they never expected me to fulfill. By the time they finished praying that Sunday morning, I had already made the decision that would turn their words into reality in ways they never saw coming. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is underestimate a woman who has learned to smile through your sympathy while building her freedom in the shadows. My name is Lena Gibson, and for the past 15 years I had been the object of Cedar Grove Baptist Church's most persistent prayer requests. Not because I asked to be, but because poverty apparently is something that shows on your clothes, your shoes, and the way you count quarters at the grocery store checkout line. The congregation had decided long ago that my family needed saving, and they had appointed themselves as our spiritual financial advisors. It started innocently enough when I first walked through the doors of Cedar Grove Baptist I was 32, recently divorced, with 2 small children, and a minimum wage job at the local diner. My ex-husband Derek had left us with nothing but debt and a trailer that leaked when it rained. I came to church seeking community, maybe some peace, definitely some hope. What I found was a congregation eager to adopt us as their charity case. Sister Margaret Thornfield, the pastor's wife and self-appointed keeper of everyone's business, took one look at my discount store dress and decided we were her personal mission field. She had that particular brand of Southern kindness that feels like a warm hug but leaves you feeling smaller somehow. The kind that comes with casseroles and unsolicited advice about budgeting your food stamp. "Bless your heart, honey," she'd say after every service, pressing a $20 bill into my palm while the other church ladies watched with approving nods. "The Lord sees your struggle, and we're all praying for breakthrough in your finances." I should have been grateful. Any reasonable person would have been grateful. Here was a community willing to help a single mother make ends meet. But there was something in the way they looked at me, something in the tone they used when they spoke about poor Lena and those sweet babies, that made my skin crawl. They didn't see a woman capable of more. They saw a project, a permanent resident of their prayer list, someone who would always need their help because surely I couldn't help myself. The assumptions started small. When I missed a church potluck, Sister Margaret would pat my arm and whisper, "I know you couldn't afford to bring anything, sweetie. Don't you worry about it." When my daughter Emma needed school supplies, the church ladies would organize a collection without asking if I had already handled. When my son Tyler wanted to join the church youth group's camping trip, they'd quietly slip the registration fee to me with knowing smiles and gentle suggestions that I should let them bless us. I played along because I needed the community, and my children needed the stability. Cedar Grove became our second home. Emma and Tyler grew up in those pews, made friends in Sunday school, found belonging in the youth group. I served where I could, helped with church dinners when my work schedule allowed, cleaned the sanctuary on Saturday mornings for the small stipend they offered. But always I was the recipient, never the giver in their eyes. What they didn't know was that I had started taking night classes at the community college the year after I joined the church. Business administration, accounting, marketing. While they prayed for my financial breakthrough, I was creating it myself, one late-night study session at a time. While they organized bake sales to help with my electric bill, I was working toward a degree that would change everything. But I kept quiet about my ambitions. I had learned early that people are more comfortable with your struggle than your progress. They love a good rags to riches story in theory, but they prefer to write the ending themselves. So I smiled, accepted their help when I genuinely needed it, and quietly built my future in the spaces between their prayers. The breaking point came on a humid Sunday morning in July. I had been attending Cedar Grove for 15 years by then. Emma was now 19 and starting her sophomore year at State University. Tyler was 17 and had just been accepted to 3 different colleges, with partial academic scholarship. I was 37, held a bachelor's degree in business administration, and had been running my own small consulting firm for the past 3 years. But as far as the congregation knew, I was still poor Lena in need of prayer. That morning, Pastor Thornfield called for special prayer requests during the service. This was nothing new. Every Sunday featured a litany of health concerns, family troubles, and financial hardships that needed divine intervention. I sat in my usual spot, third pew from the back on the left side, listening to the familiar rhythm of community concerns. Then Sister Margaret stood up. She was 68 now, silver-haired and elegant in her Sunday best, wearing a pearl necklace that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. She cleared her throat delicately and addressed the congregation with the kind of dramatic gravity reserved for truly serious matters. "Church family," she began, her voice carrying that practiced blend of authority and compassion that made people lean forward in their seats. "I feel led to call for special prayer this morning, for one of our own who has been struggling for so many years." My stomach dropped. I knew somehow, I just knew, that whatever was coming next would change everything. "Sister Lena Gibson has been with us for 15 years now," she continued, gesturing vaguely in my direction without actually looking at me. 15 years of faithful attendance despite her circumstances. 15 years of watching her struggle to make ends meet, working multiple jobs, scraping by month after month. The congregation began to murmur in agreement, heads nodding sympathetically. I felt heat rising in my cheeks, as every pair of eyes in the sanctuary turned toward me. Emma, who was home from college for the summer, shifted uncomfortably beside me. Tyler, seated on my other side, looked down at his hands. "I believe," Sister Margaret declared, raising her voice with evangelical fervor, "that it's time for us to storm heaven on behalf of this family. Time to pray for a real financial miracle, for doors to open, for opportunities that will lift them out of poverty once and for all." Pastor Thornfield nodded solemnly from the pulpit. "Sister Margaret is right. Sometimes we need to come together in unified prayer for breakthrough. Will everyone please stand as we lift up the Gibson family?" The entire congregation rose to their feet, 147 people standing in solidarity to pray for my poor, struggling family. I stood too, because what else could I do? Refuse to stand for my own prayer, walk out and confirm every assumption they'd ever made about my character. Sister Margaret moved to the center of the aisle, her arms outstretched as if she were personally delivering my petition to the throne room of God. "Heavenly Father," she began, her voice echoing through the sanctuary, "we come before you today with heavy hearts for our sister Lena, heavy hearts, as if my very existence was a source of grief. Lord, you see her struggle. You see her working so hard just to keep food on the table, just to keep the lights on. You see her children, bright and capable but limited by their circumstances. We know you have a plan for this family, Father, but we're asking you to accelerate that plan. Open doors that no man can shut. Provide opportunities for education, for better employment, for financial stability." The congregation joined in with scattered amens and yes, lords. I could hear Mrs. Patterson behind me whispering her own additions to the prayer. Miss Davies was nodding so vigorously I could feel the pew shaking. "We pray for wisdom in managing finances, for discipline in spending, for contentment in all circumstances." Sister Margaret continued. The implication was clear. I was poor because I lacked wisdom, discipline, and contentment. "But most of all, Lord, we pray for abundance. Let this family experience your provision in ways they've never imagined." As the prayer went on, something inside me shifted, not in the spiritual way they were hoping for, but in a deeper, more fundamental way. I realized that no matter what I accomplished, no matter how far I'd come, this congregation would always see me as the broken single mother who walked through their doors 15 years ago. They had built their identity as compassionate Christians, partly on my ongoing need, and they weren't prepared to let that narrative go. When Sister Margaret finally said, "Amen," preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The congregation erupted in applause, actual applause, as if they had just performed some great service to humanity by publicly highlighting my supposed poverty. People came up to me afterward, pressing envelopes into my hands, offering to pay for Tyler's senior photos, suggesting I apply for the church's emergency fund to help with college expenses. I smiled, thanked them graciously, and made appropriate noises of gratitude, but inside I was done being their project, done being the object of their pity, done allowing them to define my family's story. That afternoon I drove home to my house, not a trailer, but a 3-bedroom ranch-style home I had purchased 2 years earlier, and sat at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. At the top of the page I wrote, "Making their prayer come true." If the congregation wanted to pray for my family's abundance, I was going to give them exactly what they asked for, but not in the way they expected, and certainly not in a way that would allow them to take credit for it. They had spent 15 years praying for my breakthrough, while assuming I was incapable of creating it myself. Time to show them what God could do through a woman they had consistently underestimated. The first thing I did was calculate exactly how much money the congregation had given my family over the past 15 years. Not out of spite, but out of precision. If I was going to make their prayers come true, I wanted to understand the full scope of what they considered poverty versus abundance. I pulled out 15 years' worth of carefully organized financial records, something a truly poor person wouldn't have, but they had never asked to see my filing system. Every envelope of cash, every paid bill, every emergency fund contribution was documented. The total came to approximately $38,000 over 15 years, or about $2,500 per year. In their minds, this modest charity was keeping my family afloat. What they didn't know was that $38,000 was roughly equivalent to 1 month's revenue from my consulting business. What they saw as financial salvation, I saw as proof of how small their imagination was when it came to my potential. I had built Gibson Solutions Consulting from nothing, starting with freelance bookkeeping for small businesses while finishing my degree. By 2020, I was managing financial systems for 12 local companies. By 2022, I had expanded to include business development and marketing strategy. By 2024, I had a team of 6 employees and clients in 4 states, but I had been careful, strategic even, about how much my success showed. I still lived in the same neighborhood, still drove a modest car, still shopped at discount stores out of habit and preference. Not because I had to, but because I chose to. There's a difference between frugality and poverty, but the congregation had never bothered to learn it. My children knew the truth, of course. Emma's college tuition was paid in full. Tyler's college fund was already established. We took family vacations, ate at nice restaurants occasionally, and lived comfortably within our means. But at church, we maintained the same quiet presence we'd always had. We didn't flash wealth because we didn't need to prove anything to anyone, until now. Sister Margaret's prayer had made something crystal clear. The congregation's charity wasn't really about helping my family. It was about maintaining their own sense of righteousness. They needed me to stay poor so they could stay generous. They needed my struggle so they could feel successful. They had turned my family into a permanent fixture in their narrative of Christian service. Well, if they wanted to pray for abundance, I was going to show them what abundance looked like. Not the slow, modest improvement they expected, but the kind of sudden dramatic change that would force them to confront every assumption they'd ever made about poverty, success, and who deserves what in this world. I spent the rest of that Sunday afternoon making phone calls, first to my business lawyer, then to my accountant, then to my real estate agent. By Monday morning, I had set in motion a series of events that would turn the congregation's prayers into reality, in ways that would challenge everything they thought they knew about blessing, provision, and the woman they had spent 15 years underestimating. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. I was going to accept their prayer with gratitude and watch as God used their own words to reveal the truth they had been too blind to see. Some prayers, I realized, are more dangerous than we know, especially when they're answered by someone who has been quietly preparing for the moment when she finally decides to step out of the shadows and into the light they never knew was there. That week, I began documenting everything, not for revenge, but for clarity. I wanted a record of exactly how the congregation responded when their prayers were answered in ways they hadn't anticipated. I was curious to see if their faith in divine provision extended to recognizing it when it came through channels they hadn't approved. Because the truth about Sister Margaret's prayer wasn't that it was false. My family had indeed struggled, and we had indeed received help when we needed it. The truth was that it was incomplete. They had prayed for doors to open without recognizing that I had already walked through several. They had prayed for opportunities without seeing the ones I had created. They had prayed for wisdom and discipline without acknowledging that I had been practicing both for years. Now it was time to show them what 15 years of quiet wisdom and discipline could accomplish when combined with the kind of faith that doesn't just pray for miracles. It prepares for them. As I sat in my comfortable home office that evening, surrounded by the evidence of a business I had built from nothing, I thought about the congregation's prayer one more time. They had asked God to provide for my family in ways we had never imagined. They had no idea how right they were. The invisibility began with good intentions, the way most harmful things do. When I first started attending Cedar Grove Baptist, the congregation genuinely wanted to help a struggling single mother. But somewhere between their initial kindness and 15 years of routine charity, I had become less of a person and more of a symbol, a living reminder of their own generosity, a permanent fixture on their prayer list that made them feel purposeful and needed. I didn't notice it happening at first. When you're genuinely struggling, you're grateful for any help that comes your way. Those early years were hard in ways I don't like to remember. Working double shifts at Mel's Diner, coming home exhausted to help Emma with second-grade homework while Tyler napped on the couch, the electricity getting shut off twice, the phone disconnected for 3 months, the constant anxiety of living paycheck to paycheck with no safety net. During those years, Cedar Grove's help was a lifeline. Sister Margaret would show up with bags of groceries when she somehow knew my cupboards were bare. The church ladies would bring by boxes of clothes that their children had outgrown, always in Emma and Tyler's exact size. Deacon Williams would mysteriously appear whenever something in the trailer broke, toolbox in hand and a gentle smile on his face. I was grateful then, genuinely grateful, and I made sure they knew it. I wrote thank you notes on dollar store stationery. I brought them small gifts when I could afford it, usually something homemade, like cookies or jam. I volunteered for every church event that didn't conflict with my work schedule, stuffing envelopes, setting up chairs, washing dishes after potluck dinner. But as the years passed and my circumstances slowly improved, the congregation's perception of me remained frozen in time. Even as I moved from the leaking trailer to a small apartment, even as I was promoted from waitress to assistant manager at the diner, even as my children grew from struggling elementary students to honor roll teenagers, Cedar Grove continued to see the broken young mother who had first walked through their doors. The first real sign of my invisibility came when I graduated from community college I had spent 4 years taking night classes while working full-time, studying at the kitchen table after Emma and Tyler went to bed, surviving on coffee and determination. My graduation ceremony was on a Thursday evening, and I had mentioned it to several church members in the weeks leading up to it, hoping someone might come to celebrate this milestone with us. Nobody showed up. Not one person from the congregation that had been praying for my success actually came to witness it. I sat in that auditorium with Emma and Tyler, watching other graduates embrace their families and friends, and realized that somehow my achievement didn't fit the narrative they had created about my life. They wanted to pray for my breakthrough, but they weren't prepared to celebrate when it actually happened. The following Sunday I mentioned my graduation to Sister Margaret after service, thinking perhaps she had simply forgotten. "Oh honey, that's nice," she said, already looking past me towards someone else. "Bless your heart for trying to better yourself. Now, did you get that application for the food assistance program I left in your mailbox?" Food assistant. I had been supporting my family without government aid for over a year at that point, but she was still operating from an outdated understanding of my situation. When I tried to explain that I no longer needed that kind of help, she patted my arm and said, "I know pride can make it hard to accept help, but the Lord wants us to be practical." That's when I began to understand that their help had never really been about me. It was about them. My poverty gave them purpose, made them feel needed, allowed them to live out their Christian duty in a tangible way. My success, on the other hand, threatened that dynamic. If I didn't need their help anymore, what did that say about their role in my life? So they simply chose not to see it. When I started my bookkeeping business in 2014, working with 3 small local companies while still maintaining my job at the diner, I mentioned it during a church prayer meeting. I was excited about this new opportunity, hopeful about building something of my own. I asked for prayers for wisdom and success in this new venture. The response was polite but dismissive. "That's wonderful, dear," said Mrs. Henderson, who ran the church's finance committee. "It's good to have little side projects. Just make sure you don't take on more than you can handle." Little side projects. I was building a business that would eventually support my family better than the diner ever could, but they saw it as a hobby, something cute and inconsequential. When that business grew to include 6 clients within 8 months, generating more income than my restaurant job, they didn't ask about it. When I was able to move my family from the cramped apartment to a small house, they assumed I had received some kind of assistance or inheritance. "The Lord provides in mysterious ways," Sister Margaret said when she saw our new address. "I'm sure this blessing came just when you needed it most." She never asked how the blessing had actually come. She never inquired about my business or showed interest in my growing success. In her mind, I was still the recipient of divine charity, not the architect of my own improvement. This pattern continued as my children grew older and more accomplished. Emma earned a partial academic scholarship to State University, but when I mentioned it at church, the response was always about how blessed we were to receive help with college costs. No one commented on Emma's hard work, her 3.8 GPA, or her impressive essay writing. They saw financial aid, not achievement. Tyler made honor roll every semester of high school and was accepted into the National Honor Society, but the congregation's reaction focused on how prayer had helped him overcome the disadvantages of his background. They couldn't see that he had never been disadvantaged academically, that he had been raised by a mother who valued education and created an environment where learning was encouraged and supported. The invisibility extended beyond my personal accomplishments to my contributions to the church itself. When I organized the annual Children's Christmas program in 2018, transforming what had been a chaotic 30-minute recitation into a polished hour-long production with costumes, music, and choreography, the praise went to Sister Margaret for overseeing such a wonderful event. When I redesigned the church's financial tracking system, streamlining their bookkeeping process and saving them hours of work each month, Deacon Williams received credit for modernizing their operations. I was simultaneously essential and invisible, needed but not seen. They relied on my skills, my time, my labor, but they couldn't acknowledge my competence because it contradicted their understanding of who I was supposed to be. The most painful example came in 2020, during the early months of the pandemic when many small businesses were struggling. My consulting firm had grown to 8 clients by then, and I was helping several of them navigate the challenges of remote work and reduced revenue. I offered to help Cedar Grove transition their services online, to set up virtual meetings and digital giving platforms, to create systems that would allow them to maintain community connection during lockdown. Pastor Thornfield thanked me for my enthusiasm, but explained that they had hired a professional consulting firm to handle their digital transition, a firm from the city expensive and unfamiliar with their specific needs. While I sat in their congregation, every Sunday with years of experience and a deep understanding of their community, they paid thousands of dollars to outsiders rather than trust the expertise of someone they had spent over a decade categorizing as needy. That's when I realized the full extent of my invisibility. It wasn't just that they couldn't see my success, they were actively invested in not seeing it. My competence challenged their charity. My independence threatened their purpose. My growth forced them to confront the possibility that their help, while appreciated, had never been the primary factor in my family's well-being. So they created a parallel narrative where I remained frozen in perpetual need, while they remained essential providers. In their version of my story, I was blessed but not capable, helped but not accomplished, grateful but not empowered. This became most evident in the way they talked about my children. Emma's academic success was attributed to the church's prayers and support, rather than her own intelligence and hard work. Tyler's college prospects were discussed in terms of what financial aid he might receive, rather than what he had earned through his achievement. They spoke about my children as if they were charity cases who had been rescued by Christian kindness, rather than young people who had been raised by a competent mother who valued education and worked multiple jobs to provide for them. The congregation had created a mythology around my family that served their own spiritual needs, while erasing our actual agency and accomplishment. We were proof of God's provision in their lives, evidence of their faithfulness as a church community, a success story they could claim credit for without acknowledging the work and determination that had actually created that success. By 2022, when my business had grown large enough to require employees and I was earning more in a month than I used to make in a year, the disconnect between reality and perception had become almost surreal. I would sit in church on Sundays, listening to prayers for my family's financial stability, while mentally reviewing the business contracts I had signed that week. I would accept their continued offers of assistance while calculating the tax implications of my quarterly earnings. The breaking point should have come sooner, but I had grown comfortable with the arrangement in my own way. Their underestimation had given me freedom to build something substantial without interference or unwanted advice. Their assumption that I needed help had allowed me to fly under the radar while I established myself professionally. Their charity had become irrelevant to my actual needs, but it had also become harmless, or so I thought, until Sister Margaret's prayer changed everything. Standing in that church, listening to her describe my family as if we were still the struggling single-parent household from 2009, I realized that their invisibility had a cost I hadn't fully calculated. My children had grown up watching a community treat their mother as perpetually needy, despite clear evidence to the contrary. They had learned to accept charity for circumstances that no longer existed, to smile graciously while people made assumptions about their limitations, to downplay their own achievements so as not to disturb the narrative others had created about their lives. Emma had stopped mentioning her academic successes at church because the responses always focused on how blessed she was to overcome her disadvantages, rather than how hard she had worked to earn her accomplishment. Tyler had learned not to talk about his college plans, because the conversations immediately turned to financial concerns and scholarship opportunities, as if his intellectual achievements were secondary to his economic need. I had taught my children to be grateful for help we no longer needed, and humble about successes we had rightfully earned. I had modeled accommodation to other people's limited perceptions, rather than confident ownership of our actual circumstance. In trying to maintain harmony with the congregation, I had inadvertently taught my children that their truth mattered less than other people's comfort. That realization hit me like a physical blow, as I stood there listening to Sister Margaret pray for our poverty. My children were watching this woman publicly declare their family poor, while we sat in clothes we could afford, drove a car we owned outright, and prepared to pay college tuition without debt. They were learning that truth is optional if speaking it makes other people uncomfortable. The prayer wasn't just about me anymore, it was about what I was teaching Emma and Tyler about their worth, their agency, their right to be seen accurately by the world around them. It was about whether I would continue to accept other people's diminished view of our family, for the sake of keeping peace with a community that benefited from our invisibility. When Sister Margaret finally said, "Amen," that Sunday morning, I made a decision that had been building for years. I was done being invisible, done accommodating their need to see me as perpetually struggling, done allowing them to pray for problems that no longer existed while ignoring achievements that had always been real. If they wanted to pray for my family's abundance, I was going to show them what that abundance looked like, not gradually, not with careful explanations and gentle corrections, but dramatically and undeniably. I was going to make their prayer come true in ways that would force them to confront every assumption they had ever made about poverty, success, and the woman they had spent 15 years consistently underestimating. The invisible years were over. It was time to step into the light and let them see what they had refused to notice all along. That afternoon, as I sat in my home office, surrounded by the evidence of a business I had built while they prayed for my breakthrough, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly, but a kind of fierce clarity. I had spent 15 years being grateful for their charity, while building my own prosperity. I had accepted their help when I needed it, and continued accepting their perception long after I needed their assistance. Now it was time to show them the difference between praying for someone's success and recognizing it when it's already there. The plan that began forming in my mind wasn't about revenge or embarrassment, it was about truth. It was about forcing a community that claimed to value honesty and faith to confront their own blindness. It was about teaching my children that their reality mattered more than other people's comfort, that their achievements deserved recognition rather than diminishment, that their mother's competence was worth defending, even when defending it made others uncomfortable. Sister Margaret had prayed for doors to open for my family. She had no idea that I had been walking through those doors for years while she kept her eyes focused on the closed ones behind me. She had prayed for opportunities that would lift us out of poverty without recognizing the opportunities I had already created and seized. But prayers, I had learned, are powerful things, and sometimes they're answered by the very people who were quietly preparing for the breakthrough while others were still asking for it. The congregation wanted to see God's provision in my life. I was about to show them what 15 years of God working through a woman's determination, intelligence, and hard work actually looked like. They had prayed for abundance they could recognize. I was going to give them abundance they couldn't ignore. The planning began on Monday morning with a phone call to my accountant, Rachel Martinez, who had been managing Gibson Solutions Consulting's books for the past 3 years. Rachel was a no-nonsense woman in her 40s, who understood both business strategy and the delicate art of timing financial revelation. I need to restructure some things, I told her, settling into my home office chair with a fresh cup of coffee and a legal pad covered in notes I had made the night before. I want to make certain aspects of my financial situation more visible, more public. Rachel was quiet for a moment. She knew about my situation at Cedar Grove, had heard me reference the congregation's assumptions during our quarterly meetings, when we discussed charitable giving strategies. What kind of visibility are we talking about? The kind that makes it impossible to ignore. I want to establish a foundation, something substantial enough to require public filings. I want to make some community investments that will generate local media attention. And I want to do it all in a way that connects back to the church's prayers for my family. I could hear Rachel typing on her keyboard. How substantial are we talking for the foundation? Initial funding of $250,000, I said, the number rolling off my tongue with a certainty that surprised even me. More to follow once it's established. Rachel's typing stopped. Lena, that's going to require some serious financial disclosure. Are you prepared for that level of transparency? I looked around my office, taking in the awards on my wall from the Regional Business Association, the framed articles about small business success that had featured my company, the photographs of ribbon cuttings for businesses I had helped launch. All of this existed in a parallel universe from the one Cedar Grove inhabited, where I was still the struggling single mother counting quarters for groceries. I'm prepared, I said. In fact, I'm looking forward to it. The foundation would be called the Gibson Family Educational Foundation, dedicated to providing college scholarships for single-parent households in our county. It was a cause close to my heart, obviously, but it was also strategically chosen. Education funding always generated positive press, and the focus on single parents would naturally draw attention to my own story as someone who had supposedly overcome those challenges. Of course, the congregation would learn that the woman they had been praying for had actually been funding other families' educational dreams, while they assumed she couldn't afford her own children's schooling. The second phone call went to Marcus Thompson, a former client who now worked as a real estate developer in our town. Marcus had built several commercial properties over the past 5 years, including the new medical complex on Main Street and the shopping center near the highway. More importantly, he understood the value of strategic business partnerships. "I have a proposition for you," I said when Marcus answered his phone. "I want to invest in a major development project, something that will have significant community impact and require public announcement." Marcus chuckled. "You've been holding out on me, Lena. I knew your business was doing well, but investment-level capital is a different conversation entirely." "My business has been doing better than most people realize," I said, "and I'm ready to start making that more apparent. What kind of projects do you have in development that could use a major investor?" He launched into descriptions of 3 different opportunities: a mixed-use development that would include retail space and affordable housing, a renovation of the old textile mill into artist studios and small business offices, and a new recreational complex with a community center and walking trails. The mill renovation caught my attention immediately. The old Riverside textile mill had been sitting empty for 8 years, a constant reminder of jobs lost when manufacturing moved overseas. It was visible from the highway, a landmark that everyone in town knew. Transforming it into something positive and productive would generate significant community interest in media coverage. "How much investment would make me a major partner in the mill project?" I asked. "For significant partnership with naming rights and development input, we're talking about a $500,000 commitment," Marcus said. "But Lena, that's serious money. Are you sure you're in a position to send me the paperwork?" I interrupted Jen. "I'll have my lawyer review it. But yes, I'm in a position to make that commitment." After I hung up, I sat in the quiet of my office and let the magnitude of what I was planning settle over me. In the span of 2 phone calls, I had committed to spending $750,000 in ways that would make my financial situation impossible to ignore or misinterpret. It was money I had earned through years of building my business while the congregation prayed for my breakthrough, but it was also money that would shatter every assumption they had ever made about my capability. The 3rd call was to Jennifer Walsh, a journalist at the County Herald who had interviewed me 2 years earlier for a series about women entrepreneurs. Jennifer was smart, thorough, and had a talent for connecting local business stories to broader themes about economic development and community growth. "I'm planning some significant community investments," I told Jennifer after we exchanged pleasantries. "A foundation launch, a major development partnership, possibly some other projects. I thought you might be interested in following the story." "Absolutely," Jennifer said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice. Good local business stories were sometimes hard to find, and she had always been supportive of highlighting women's success in traditionally male-dominated fields. "Can you give me a preview of what we're talking about?" I outlined the foundation and the mill project, watching Jennifer's enthusiasm grow as I described the scope of what I was planning. "This is exactly the kind of positive economic development story our readers love," she said. "And honestly, it's refreshing to write about local success rather than just business closures and job losses." We scheduled an interview for the following week, after I had finalized the legal paperwork for both projects. Jennifer wanted to do a comprehensive piece that would explore not just the current investments, but the business journey that had made them possible. She was particularly interested in the angle of a single mother building a successful consulting firm, and then using that success to benefit other families in similar situations. "It's a great narrative arc," she said. "From struggling single parent to successful entrepreneur to community philanthropist, our readers will eat that up." What Jennifer didn't know, what I wasn't ready to tell her yet, was that the most interesting part of the story wasn't the success itself. It was the fact that I had achieved this success while an entire community assumed I was still struggling, still in need of their charity, still the same person who had walked into their church 15 years ago with nothing but hope and determination. The 4th call was the most delicate. I contacted David Chen, the marketing director at First National Bank, where I had maintained both personal and business accounts for the past 8 years. David had watched my deposits grow from hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands of dollars per month, but banking relationships are confidential. No one outside the bank knew the full scope of my financial growth. "I'm planning some major community investments," I told David, and I want to make sure the bank is positioned to be part of the story. These will be significant transactions that might generate media attention, and I want to ensure we handle everything properly. David was immediately interested. Banks love being associated with positive community development stories, especially when they involve successful local businesses. We discussed the timing of the various transactions, the paperwork that would need to be filed for the foundation, and the public relations opportunities that might arise. I have to say, Lena, David said toward the end of our conversation, I've been watching your account growth over the years, and it's been impressive, but this level of community investment suggests your business has reached a scale that most people probably don't realize. That's exactly right, I said, and I think it's time for that to change. By the end of that first week, I had lawyers preparing foundation documents, accountants structuring investment partnerships, and journalists planning feature stories. I had set in motion a series of events that would make my financial success not just visible but unavoidable, documented in legal filings, and newspaper articles and public records that anyone could access. But the most important part of my plan wasn't the public revelations, it was the timing. I wanted everything to be finalized and announced during the week leading up to Cedar Grove's annual Blessing Sunday, the special service they held every August to celebrate God's provision in the lives of church members. It was the one Sunday each year when people were invited to stand up and share testimonies about how they had experienced divine blessing and breakthrough. For 15 years, I had sat quietly during Blessing Sunday, while other people shared stories of job promotions, healed relationships, and answered prayers. I had never stood up because I didn't want to draw attention to my improving circumstances, didn't want to challenge the narrative that had positioned me as someone who needed prayer rather than someone who had things to be thankful for. This year would be different. This year I would stand up during testimony time and thank God for the incredible blessing of being able to establish a $250,000 foundation and invest $500,000 in community development. I would share how grateful I was for the business success that had made these investments possible, for the wisdom to build something substantial, for the opportunity to give back to the community that had supported my family, and I would do it all with the humble gratitude of someone who recognized God's hand in her success, while the congregation sat there trying to reconcile this testimony with their prayers for my poor struggling family. The beauty of the plan was its complete honesty. I wasn't exaggerating my success or pretending to be wealthier than I was. Every dollar I planned to invest was money I had earned legitimately through years of hard work and smart business decisions. Every legal document was accurate and transparent. Every newspaper article would be factually correct. The shock would come not from deception but from revelation, not from lies, but from the truth they had been too blind to see. As the weeks passed and the various pieces of my plan fell into place, I found myself paying closer attention to the congregation's continued assumptions about my circumstances. The irony became almost comical. Sister Margaret still slipped me $20 bills after church services. Miss Patterson continued to bring me coupons for the grocery store. Deacon Williams asked if I needed help with Tyler's senior year expenses. All of this happening while I was finalizing contracts that involved more money than most of them made in several years. The foundation paperwork was completed first. The Gibson Family Educational Foundation was officially established as a 501c3 nonprofit organization, with initial funding of $250,000. And a mission to provide college scholarships for students from single-parent households in our county. The first round of scholarships would be announced in the fall with awards ranging from $2,500 to $10,000 per recipient. I had structured the foundation to be entirely transparent, with public filings that would show exactly how much money had been contributed and by whom. My name would be listed as the founding donor, along with the full amount of my initial contribution. Anyone who cared to look would be able to see that the woman Cedar Grove had been praying for had quietly become one of the county's most significant educational philanthropists. The mill project moved forward just as smoothly. Marcus and I finalized the partnership agreement that made me a 40% investor in the Riverside Mill restoration. The project would transform the abandoned textile facility into the Riverside Creative Center,
featuring artist studios, small business offices, a community event space, and a cafe. Construction would begin in the fall with completion scheduled for the following summer. The investment amount, the naming rights I had secured, and my role in the project planning would all be matters of public record. The local Economic Development Office would issue press releases highlighting the private investment that was making the project possible. My name would be featured prominently as both a successful local business owner and a community-minded investor. Jennifer Walsh's article was scheduled to run the Thursday before Blessing Sunday, giving the story 3 days to circulate before the church service. She had spent 2 hours interviewing me about my business journey, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges of building a consulting firm, the rewards of entrepreneurship, and my motivations for investing in community development. During the interview, I had been carefully honest about my history without directly mentioning the congregation's assumption. I talked about starting the business while working at the diner, about taking night classes while raising 2 children, about the slow process of building client relationships, and establishing credibility in a competitive field. It sounds like you've been building this success for years, Jennifer observed.
But you don't seem to have sought much publicity for your achievements. Why the change now? I considered my answer carefully. I think there's value in letting success speak for itself rather than announcing every milestone along the way. But there comes a point where privacy can become invisibility, where staying quiet starts to serve other people's assumptions rather than your own goals. I'm ready to be more open about what God has enabled me to accomplish. The article would include photographs of me in my office, quotes from clients about the impact of my work on their businesses, and details about both the foundation and the mill investment. It would present a comprehensive picture of a successful entrepreneur who had built something substantial while flying under the radar of public attention. What it wouldn't include, because I hadn't shared this information with Jennifer, was the congregation's 15-year narrative about my poverty or their recent prayers for my family's financial breakthrough. That context would become apparent to readers who knew me through Cedar Grove, but the article itself would simply present the facts of my success without reference to anyone's prior misconception. The timing was crucial, because I wanted the congregation to learn about my investments the same way the rest of the community would, through the newspaper, through public records, through the undeniable evidence of substantial financial capability. I didn't want to announce my success privately to church members, didn't want to have individual conversations where I corrected their assumptions gently and diplomatically. I wanted the truth to be unavoidable, public, and impossible to minimize or reinterpret. The foundation announcement was scheduled for Friday, with press releases going out to regional media outlets and nonprofit organizations. The mill project announcement would follow on Monday, timed to coordinate with the Economic Development Office's quarterly newsletter about local investment activity. By the time Sunday rolled around, everyone in town would know that Lena Gibson, the single mother the congregation had been praying for, was actually one of the county's most significant business success stories and community investor. The week before Blessing Sunday, I made one final addition to my plan. I contacted the regional television station that covered business news for our area and arranged for them to film a segment about the foundation launch. Local philanthropy always made for good human interest stories, especially when it involved someone who had overcome challenges to achieve success. The television piece would air Saturday evening, the night before Blessing Sunday. It would feature footage of me at the old mill site explaining the renovation plans and my vision for how the space would serve the community. It would include interviews with scholarship recipients from similar programs, emphasizing the impact that educational funding could have on families facing financial challenges. Most importantly, it would establish my credibility as someone who had not only achieved financial success, but was using that success to benefit others facing the same struggles I had once experienced. As Saturday evening approached and I prepared to watch my television debut, I reflected on how dramatically the narrative was about to shift. In less than 24 hours, I would walk into Cedar Grove Baptist Church, not as the object of their charitable prayers, but as the answer to those prayers in ways they had never imagined. The congregation had spent 15 years asking God to bless my family with abundance and opportunity. They were about to discover that those prayers had been answered years ago, quietly and consistently, while they were still asking for what had already been provided. Sister Margaret had prayed for doors to open that no man could shut. She had no idea that I had been walking through those doors while she kept her eyes fixed on the ones that remained closed. The secret phase of my plan was nearly complete. Soon, there would be no more secrets, no more assumptions, and no more invisibility. The revelation was about to begin. The transformation began on Thursday morning when Jennifer Walsh's article appeared on the front page of the County Herald's business section. The headline read, "Local Entrepreneur Launches Major Community Investments," with a subtitle that made my heart race. Gibson Solutions Consulting founder establishes educational foundation, partners in historic mill renovation. I had picked up the newspaper from my driveway at 6 in the morning, still in my robe and slippers, and stood there in the cool August air reading about myself as if I were discovering a stranger's story. Jennifer had done an excellent job capturing not just the current investments, but the journey that had led to them. The article painted a picture of steady growth, strategic thinking, and quiet determination that had culminated in the ability to make significant community contributions. What struck me most was how normal it all sounded when presented as straightforward business news. There was nothing shocking or dramatic about a successful consulting firm owner investing in community development. It was exactly the kind of story that ran regularly in business publications across the country. The only extraordinary thing about it was that it involved someone an entire congregation believed to be poor. My phone started ringing at 7:30. The first call was from Marcus Thompson, congratulating me on the excellent press coverage and mentioning that he had already received 3 inquiries from other potential investors interested in the mill project. The second was from Rachel Martinez, my accountant, who said the foundation office had received its first scholarship inquiry less than an hour after the paper hit the stand. The third call was from Emma, who was spending the summer doing an internship in Charlotte, but still subscribed to the Herald's digital edition to keep up with news from home. "Mom," she said, her voice a mixture of pride and amazement. "I just read the article. I knew you were doing well, but I had no idea the scale was this large. The foundation, the mill investment. This is incredible." I sat down at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, feeling a strange sense of lightness. For so many years I had downplayed my success, had trained my children to be modest about our improving circumstances, had taught them to accept charity they didn't need in order to maintain harmony with people who weren't ready to see our reality. "I wanted to surprise you," I told Emma, "and I wanted to show you and Tyler that there's a difference between being humble and being invisible. I've been invisible long enough." Emma was quiet for a moment. "What's going to happen at church this Sunday?" "They're going to see this article." "I hope they do. It's time they understood who we really are." Tyler's reaction was more direct when he called an hour later. He had always been less patient with the congregation's assumptions than Emma, more frustrated by their subtle condescension and their tendency to treat him like a charity case, despite his academic achievements. "This is perfect, Mom," he said with satisfaction. "I can't wait to see Sister Margaret's face when she realizes you've been funding scholarships while she's been slipping you $20 bills." By noon, I had received calls from 2 other local business owners who wanted to discuss potential consulting projects, a representative from the Regional Economic Development Council who invited me to join their advisory board, and 3 nonprofit organizations asking about potential partnership opportunities with the foundation. The ripple effects were already beginning, but they were happening in the world where my success made sense, where business achievement was celebrated rather than ignored, where financial capability was seen as a positive rather than something that threatened other people's narratives about who I was supposed to be. Friday brought the foundation's official announcement, distributed through press releases that went to media outlets across the region. The story was picked up by the State Business Journal and 2 regional newspapers, each highlighting different aspects of the initiative. The State Journal focused on the innovative structure of the scholarship program, which would provide not just tuition assistance, but also mentoring and business development support for recipients. The regional papers emphasized the local angle, featuring quotes from education officials about the need for this type of support in our area. By Friday evening, the Gibson Family Educational Foundation had received 47 scholarship inquiries, 12 offers of volunteer assistance, and donation pledges totaling $18,000 from community members who wanted to support the mission. I spent Friday night in my office, responding to emails and organizing the paperwork that would be necessary to process the scholarship applications. It was work I loved, work that felt meaningful in ways that went beyond profit margins and business development. This was what success was supposed to enable: the ability to create opportunities for others, to use resources in ways that multiplied their impact, to turn personal achievement into community benefit. But underneath the satisfaction was a growing sense of anticipation about Sunday morning. By now, several members of Cedar Grove had almost certainly seen the newspaper coverage. The question was how they would process this information, whether they would be able to reconcile it with their 15-year narrative about my family's circumstances. Saturday brought the television segment, which aired during the evening news as a positive local interest story. The reporter Sandra Mills had done an excellent job connecting the foundation launch to broader themes about economic mobility and community development. The piece included footage of me at the mill site, explaining how the renovation would create opportunities for local artists and small business owners, and interviews with scholarship recipients from similar programs in other counties. Watching myself on television was surreal. The woman on screen was confident, articulate, clearly knowledgeable about business and community development. She spoke with the authority of someone accustomed to making significant decisions and managing substantial resources. She looked successful, sounded successful, obviously was successful. She bore no resemblance to the struggling single mother the congregation had been praying for that morning just 3 weeks earlier. Emma and Tyler both called to say they had watched the segment and were proud of how I had represented both my business and the foundation. Emma mentioned that several of her college friends had seen the story on social media and were impressed by her mother's accomplishments. Tyler said his girlfriend's family had watched it and asked if he was the Lena Gibson, whose mother was launching the scholarship program. For my children, this public recognition felt like validation of what they had always known. Their mother was capable, successful, and worthy of respect. They had lived with the disconnect between our actual circumstances and the congregation's perceptions for years, had learned to navigate the awkwardness of accepting charity for problems that didn't exist, had watched me accomplish things that went unnoticed by people who claimed to care about our family. Now the truth was public, undeniable, impossible to minimize or ignore. Sunday morning arrived with typical August humidity, and the kind of bright sunshine that made everything feel more vivid, more significant. I chose my outfit carefully: a navy blue dress that was elegant without being flashy, pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, and low heels that were comfortable enough for standing during testimony time. I looked successful but not ostentatious, prosperous but not intimidating. I wanted to appear exactly like what I was: a woman who had worked hard, achieved substantial success, and was ready to share that success with her community. Emma and Tyler had both driven home Saturday night, so they could attend Blessing Sunday with me. Emma wore a summer dress that she had bought with money from her part-time job at college, not with assistance from the church's youth fund. Tyler wore a suit he had purchased for his National Honor Society induction, not borrowed from the church's clothing ministry. We looked like what we were: a successful family that had overcome challenges through hard work and determination, not a charity case that needed ongoing support from a benevolent congregation. The drive to church was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what the morning might bring. I felt calm in a way that surprised me. This wasn't about confrontation or revenge, it was about truth, about stepping into the light after years of allowing others to keep me in the shadows, about claiming my story instead of letting others write it for me. We arrived at church 15 minutes before the service began, our usual timing. The parking lot looked normal, filled with the familiar cars of people I had worshipped alongside for 15 years. Nothing seemed different on the surface, but I could feel the undercurrent of awareness that comes when news has traveled through a small community. Sister Margaret was standing near the entrance greeting people as they arrived. She looked up as we approached, and I saw something flicker across her face: recognition, confusion, perhaps a hint of uncertainty. She had clearly seen the newspaper coverage, clearly understood that something had shifted, but she wasn't sure how to process it. "Good morning, Lena," she said, her voice carrying its usual warmth but with an undertone I couldn't quite identify. "Beautiful day for Blessing Sunday." "It certainly is," I replied, meeting her eyes directly. "I'm looking forward to sharing what God has been doing in our lives." Sister Margaret's smile faltered slightly. She glanced at Emma and Tyler, both of whom looked confident and composed, then back at me. I could see her trying to reconcile the family standing before her with the struggling single-parent household she had prayed for just 3 weeks earlier. "Well," she said finally, "the Lord certainly works in mysterious ways." "He does indeed," I agreed, "sometimes in ways that take years to become apparent." We moved into the sanctuary and took our usual seats in the third pew from the back. I noticed several people glancing our direction, some with curiosity, others with what looked like confusion. Mrs. Patterson nodded at me with a strange expression, as if she was seeing me for the first time. Deacon Williams gave me a thoughtful look that lingered longer than usual. The word had definitely spread. The question was how they would interpret it. Pastor Thornfield began the service with his typical enthusiasm, welcoming everyone to Blessing Sunday, and explaining that this was our annual opportunity to celebrate God's faithfulness and provision. He spoke about the importance of recognizing divine blessing in our lives, about sharing testimonies that would encourage and inspire the congregation, about giving credit where credit was due for the good things that had happened in our community. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 15 years I had given credit to the congregation's prayers and support for my family's gradual improvement, had allowed them to see themselves as instruments of divine provision in our lives. Today I was going to give credit where it was actually due, to God working through my own efforts, intelligence, and determination. The first part of the service proceeded normally. We sang hymns, listened to announcements, participated in responsive reading, but I could feel the anticipation building, both in myself and in the congregation. Several people kept glancing my direction, clearly wondering if I would stand during testimony time, clearly uncertain about how to interpret the newspaper coverage, in light of their long-held assumptions about my circumstance. When Pastor Thornfield called for testimonies, the usual hands went up. Mrs. Chen shared about her daughter's successful surgery. Mr. Rodriguez talked about his son's college graduation. Mrs. Williams gave thanks for her husband's new job after months of unemployment. Each testimony followed the familiar pattern: a problem or challenge, prayer and community support, divine intervention, grateful acknowledgement of God's provision. It was the rhythm of faith that I had participated in for 15 years, the comfortable cycle of struggle and blessing that defined how this community understood God's work in their lives. Then Pastor Thornfield looked directly at me. "Sister Lena, I know this has been a significant week for your family. Would you like to share what God has been doing?" The sanctuary fell silent. Every eye turned toward me, waiting to see how I would frame the revelations of the past few days. This was the moment I had been planning for, preparing for, praying about for weeks. I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of 15 years of assumptions settling around me like a cloak I was finally ready to remove. "Thank you, Pastor Thornfield," I began, my voice steady and clear. "I do want to share what God has been doing, because it's been truly remarkable." I looked around the sanctuary, making eye contact with people who had prayed for my family, who had offered charity to support us, who had seen us as perpetual recipients of divine blessing through their generosity. "Many of you have been praying for my family for 15 years, I continued, praying for financial stability, for educational opportunities for my children, for doors to open that would lead to greater prosperity. Those prayers have been answered in ways that I'm only now ready to share publicly." Sister Margaret was leaning forward in her pew, her expression unreadable. Mrs. Patterson had her hand pressed to her chest as if bracing for impact. Deacon Williams was nodding slowly, beginning to understand where this testimony was heading. "God has blessed me with the ability to establish the Gibson Family Educational Foundation, which will provide college scholarships for students from single-parent households. The foundation launched this week with initial funding of $250,000. A ripple of surprise moved through the congregation. I could hear whispered conversations starting and stopping, could see people exchanging glances of confusion and amazement. God has also blessed me with the opportunity to invest in community development. This week I became a major partner in the renovation of the old Riverside Mill,
contributing $500,000 to transform that space into a center for artists and small businesses. The whispers grew loud. Sister Margaret's mouth was slightly open, her prayer fan forgotten in her lap. Mrs. Patterson was staring at me as if I had begun speaking a foreign language. These investments are possible because God has blessed my consulting business beyond anything I imagined when I started it 10 years ago. Gibson Solutions Consulting now serves clients in 4 states and employs 6 people full-time. We've been honored to help dozens of small businesses grow and succeed, and that success has enabled me to give back to this community in ways I never thought possible. I paused, letting the information settle. The sanctuary was completely quiet now, everyone processing the disconnect between this testimony and their long-held understanding of my family's circumstances. I want to thank this congregation for your prayers and support over the years. I continue. Your kindness during our difficult early years meant more than you know, but I also want you to understand that God has been answering your prayers for abundance and opportunity in my life for many years now. The breakthrough you've been praying for has already happened. Emma and Tyler were smiling beside me, clearly proud to finally see their mother claim credit for her accomplishments in front of people who had consistently underestimated her. Sometimes God's provision comes through community charity, and we were grateful for that support when we needed it. But sometimes God's provision comes through personal capability, through education and hard work and business success. Both are divine blessings worthy of celebration. I sat down to scattered applause that seemed uncertain, confused, as if people weren't sure whether they should be celebrating or apologizing. Pastor Thornfield stood at the pulpit looking like a man who was trying to recalibrate his understanding of someone he thought he knew. The service continued, but I could feel the energy in the room had shifted completely. People were processing, not just the surprising news about my financial success, but the implications of that success for their own understanding of how God works, how community support functions, and how thoroughly they had misunderstood someone they had worshipped alongside for 15 years. After the service ended, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Some people approached with genuine congratulations and expressions of amazement at my accomplishments. Others seemed uncertain, struggling to reconcile their charitable assumptions with the reality of my actual circumstances. A few appeared almost offended, as if my success somehow invalidated their years of prayer and support. Sister Margaret was one of the last to approach me. She stood in front of me for a long moment, clearly struggling with how to respond to this complete reversal of her understanding. "Lena," she said finally, "I had no idea. We had no idea. All these years we thought. You thought I needed your help," I finished gently, "and for a while I did. I was grateful for that help, and I still, but I also needed space to grow, to build something, to become the person God was calling me to be. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone isn't charity, but the respect to see them as capable of creating their own success." Sister Margaret nodded slowly, though I could see she was still processing. "The foundation, the mill investment, this is really happening. It's really happening," I confirmed, "and it's just the beginning. There's a lot more I want to do for this community, a lot more ways I want to give back.
But I want to do it as a partner, not as a charity case." As we walked to our car after church, Tyler shook his head with satisfaction. "I can't believe it took this long for them to see who you really are." Emma was more thoughtful. "I think they saw what they needed to see," she said. "Their charity made them feel good about themselves. Your success challenges that narrative." I considered both perspectives as I drove home. Tyler was right that the congregation had been blind to my actual circumstances for years, but Emma was also right that their blindness served a purpose, fulfilled a need in their own spiritual lives that my independence threatened. The transformation was complete. I was no longer the struggling single mother they prayed for every Sunday. I was a successful business owner, community investor, and philanthropist who happened to attend their church. I had stepped out of the shadows they had kept me in, and into the light of my actual accomplishment. The question now was whether they would be able to see God's hand in this kind of success, whether they could celebrate provision that came through personal agency rather than community charity, whether they could embrace a narrative where the person they had been helping had actually been helping herself all along. Some of them would adjust, would recognize that my success was as much a divine blessing as my earlier struggles had been an opportunity for their service. Others would struggle with the reversal, would feel confused or even betrayed by the discovery that their prayers had been answered in ways they hadn't recognized. But for the first time in 15 years, their comfort with my story was no longer my responsibility. I had told the truth, claimed my accomplishments, and stepped into the identity I had been building quietly for years, while they focused on the version of me that fit their need. The transformation was complete, but the real test would come in how this revelation changed our relationships going forward. I was no longer someone who needed their help, but I was still someone who wanted to be part of their community. The difference was that now I would be part of it, as an equal, not as a project. The aftermath unfolded over the following weeks, like ripples spreading across still water, each wave revealing new layers of how thoroughly my revelation had disrupted the congregation's understanding of charity, blessing, and their own role in God's provision. By Monday morning, 3 different people had called to ask if the newspaper coverage was accurate, as if my testimony in front of the entire congregation might somehow have been an elaborate misunderstanding. Miss Henderson from the Finance Committee was the first to call, her voice carefully controlled in that way people use when they're trying not to sound accusatory. "Lena, dear," she began, "I've been thinking about your testimony yesterday, and I have to. When you said you'd funded the foundation with $250,000, did you mean that was a pledge over several years, or?" "I meant I transferred that amount to the foundation's account last week," I replied calmly. "The full amount, immediately available for scholarship awards." There was a long pause. "And the mill investment? $500,000, committed and transferred to the development partnership on Friday." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear Miss Henderson's mental calculations, trying to reconcile these numbers with her 15-year understanding of my financial situation. "Lena," she said finally, "I don't understand. We've been taking up collections for your family's needs for years. Just last Christmas, we raised money to help with Tyler's college expenses." This was the conversation I had been expecting, the one that would force us to confront the uncomfortable reality of what had actually been happening. The congregation hadn't just been offering charity to someone who needed it. They had been insisting on charity for someone who no longer required it, and I had been accepting it to avoid challenging their assumptions. "Miss Henderson," I said carefully, "my family appreciated the congregation's support during our genuinely difficult early years, but my circumstances changed significantly as my business grew. I should have been clearer about that change, and you should have asked about it. But why didn't you tell us? Why didn't you say something when we were raising money for expenses you could already afford?" It was a fair question, one I had been wrestling with myself. The honest answer was complicated, involving my own reluctance to challenge people's perceptions, my children's comfort with the community they had grown up in, and my gradual realization that the congregation's charity was more about their spiritual needs than my financial one. "I think," I said slowly, "we all got comfortable with a story that served multiple purposes. You got to feel generous and helpful. I got to maintain privacy about my growing success. My children got to stay connected to a community that had been important to them. But comfort isn't always honest, and stories aren't always accurate." Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. "So when we were praying for your breakthrough, the breakthrough had already happened," I finished. "Multiple times, over multiple years. You were praying for something that already existed while looking right past the evidence of its existence." The conversation ended with a polite but strained goodbye, leaving me with the uncomfortable awareness that similar discussions would likely be happening throughout the congregation. People would be reviewing years of charitable giving, questioning their own perceptions, wondering what else they might have misunderstood about the people they thought they knew. By Tuesday, the ripple effects had reached the local business community in ways I hadn't anticipated. David Chen called from the bank to let me know that 2 other Cedar Grove members had come in to ask about the foundation, apparently wanting to verify that my donations were real. I couldn't give them specific information, of course, David said, but I confirmed that the Gibson Family Educational Foundation is legitimate, and well-funded. They seemed surprised. That afternoon, Marcus Thompson called with an update on the mill project that revealed another dimension of the community's reaction. "I've had 3 different people contact me since your church testimony," he said, his voice amused. "All Cedar Grove members, all wanting to know if your investment in the mill was legitimate, or if you had somehow exaggerated your contribution." "What did you tell them?" "I told them that your investment was not only real but that you had been the most prepared and knowledgeable partner I'd worked with in years. Your business plan review was more thorough than most professional developers I know." Marcus paused, then continued with obvious curiosity. "Lena, what exactly was the dynamic at your church? These people seem genuinely shocked that you're successful, as if they had no idea you were capable of this level of achievement." I found myself explaining the 15-year narrative that had positioned my family as perpetual recipients of charity, the assumptions that had crystallized into unquestioned truth, the way success can become invisible when it doesn't match people's expectations. "That's fascinating," Marcus said. "And honestly, it explains why you were so understated about your business when we first met. I remember thinking you were being unnecessarily modest about your accomplishment." Wednesday brought a call from Jennifer Walsh, the reporter who had written the Herald article. She had been contacted by several people asking for clarification about my story, apparently wanting confirmation that her reporting was accurate. "I've never had this kind of response to a business feature," Jennifer said. "Usually people just read about local success and move on, but I've had at least 6 calls asking me to verify details about your foundation and the mill investment, as if they suspect the story might be exaggerated." She paused, then asked the question I had been expecting. "Is there a bigger story here? Some reason why your business success would be controversial or surprising to people who know you?" I considered how much to share with Jennifer. The full story of the congregation's assumptions and my long-hidden success would make for compelling journalism, but it would also publicly embarrass people who had genuinely tried to help my family, even if their help had been based on outdated information. "I think some people had an incomplete picture of my circumstances," I said carefully. "Business success can be easy to overlook when it doesn't match people's expectations." Jennifer, being a good reporter, heard the story behind my diplomatic language. "Would you be interested in doing a follow-up piece about misconceptions around financial success? I think there might be a broader conversation here about how communities perceive and support economic mobility." It was an intriguing idea, one that could address the issues my revelation had raised without directly targeting Cedar Grove or individual congregation members. We scheduled a preliminary discussion for the following week. Thursday afternoon brought an unexpected visit. Sister Margaret showed up at my house, something she had never done in 15 years of knowing me. She stood on my front porch looking uncertain, holding a manila envelope and wearing an expression I couldn't quite read. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said when I opened the door. "I've been thinking about Sunday, about everything you shared, and I need to have a conversation that I probably should have had years ago." I invited her in, offering coffee that she accepted with nervous hands. We sat in my living room, surrounded by the evidence of a comfortable middle-class life that she was apparently seeing clearly for the first time. The furniture was quality but not extravagant. The electronics were current but not luxurious. The books and artwork suggested education and success without ostentation. "This is a lovely home," Sister Margaret said, looking around with new eyes. "How long have you lived here?" 3 years, I replied. "I bought it when my business reached a point where I could afford the mortgage comfortably." She nodded slowly, processing this information. "Lena, I need to apologize, and I need to ask you some questions that I'm embarrassed I never asked before." She opened the manila envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. "I went through our church records for the past 15 years, she said. "Collections we've taken for your family, emergency fund distributions, special offering. The total comes to $38,412. I wasn't surprised by the amount, having done my own calculations weeks earlier, but I was surprised that she had taken the time to compile such a detailed accounting. "I need to know," Sister Margaret continued, "how much of this money did your family actually need? How much was genuinely helpful, and how much was—" It was a brave question, one that required her to confront the possibility that their charity had been misguided, that their prayers had been answered in ways they hadn't recognized, that their understanding of blessing and provision was more limited than they had realized. I thought carefully about my response. This was an opportunity for honesty that could either damage our relationship permanently or create the foundation for a more authentic connection. The first 5 years, I said slowly, we genuinely needed most of that help. The financial assistance, the practical support, the community connection during a very difficult time. Your generosity made a real difference in our lives. Sister Margaret nodded, clearly relieved to hear that some of their efforts had been meaningful. But somewhere around year 6 or 7, I continued, my circumstances began to change significantly. My business was growing, my income was stabilizing. We were moving toward genuine financial independence. The help continued, but it was no longer necessary for our survival. Why didn't you tell us? She asked, echoing Mrs. Henderson's question but with less accusation and more genuine curiosity. For several reasons, I said. Initially, I wasn't sure how permanent the success would be. Starting a business is uncertain, and I didn't want to refuse help prematurely. But as time went on, I realized that your offer to help had become more about your spiritual needs than my financial ones. Sister Margaret looked uncomfortable but didn't interrupt. The congregation needed a success story they could take credit for. I continued. My family had become proof of your faithfulness, evidence of God working through your generosity. If I no longer needed help, what did that say about your role in our lives? So you let us continue giving you money you didn't need. I accepted help that was offered, even when it wasn't necessary, because refusing it would have forced conversations that I wasn't sure anyone was ready for. I told myself that I was being gracious, allowing you to feel good about your charity, but honestly, I was also being cowardly. It was easier to accept unnecessary help than to challenge assumptions. Sister Margaret was quiet for several minutes, clearly processing the implications of this admission. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more reflective. We made you invisible, she said finally. We saw what we needed to see, and ignored everything else. You saw accurately for a while, I corrected. But people change, circumstances evolve, and sometimes growth happens quietly. I built my success gradually, deliberately, without fanfare. It was easy to miss because I didn't announce it. But we should have asked. We should have checked. We should have seen. I considered this, maybe, or maybe the problem was that you needed me to stay the same, so you could stay the same. My success challenged your understanding of how blessing works, how provision happens, how God chooses to answer prayers. Sister Margaret stood up abruptly and walked to my window, looking out at the well-maintained yard with its professional landscaping and automatic sprinkler system, evidence of prosperity that had been visible for years to anyone who cared to notice. I've been thinking about that prayer I offered 3 weeks ago, she said without turning around, asking God to provide abundance for your family, to open doors, to create opportunity. I was so focused on asking for things to happen that I never considered they might have already happened. She turned back to me, her expression a mixture of embarrassment and something that might have been admiration. You've been the answer to our prayers all along, haven't you? Not the recipient of divine blessing, but the proof that it had already occurred. I think, I said carefully, that divine blessing comes in many forms. Sometimes it comes through community charity when that's what's needed. Sometimes it comes through personal capability, education, hard work and business success. Both are valid expressions of God's provision. Sister Margaret sat back down, this time leaning forward with the intensity of someone trying to understand a concept that challenged her fundamental assumptions. So when we prayed for your breakthrough, you were praying for something that had already been achieved. Multiple times, over multiple years, the breakthrough had happened, but it looked different than you expected, so you didn't recognize it. She nodded slowly. And when we took up collections for college expenses, you were raising money for costs I had already budgeted for and could afford, but accepting the money allowed you to feel helpful and allowed me to avoid explaining that help was no longer necessary.
And when we organized emergency assistance, you were solving problems that had already been solved, meeting needs that no longer existed, but the gesture allowed everyone to maintain the narrative that had become comfortable. Sister Margaret sat back in her chair, looking emotionally exhausted. Lena, I don't know whether to apologize, or ask for forgiveness, or just sit here feeling foolish. You don't need to feel foolish, I said gently. You responded to what you thought you saw. Your intentions were genuine, your generosity was real, and your support did matter during the years when we actually needed it. The mistake was in assuming that circumstances never change, that people don't grow, that success can't happen quietly. She gathered her papers and prepared to leave, but paused at the door. What happens now? She asked. How do we move forward from here? Now you know who I actually am instead of who you thought I was, I said. Now we can build relationships based on reality, instead of assumption. Now you can celebrate God's provision in my life, instead of praying for provision that already exists. Sister Margaret smiled for the first time since she had arrived. And now I can ask you to serve on the church finance committee, instead of asking if you need help with your electric bill. After she left, I sat in my living room, thinking about how thoroughly the revelation had shifted, not just how people saw me, but how they understood their own role in our community's ecosystem of support and success.
The congregation had spent 15 years believing they were helping someone who needed help, when in reality they had been offering charity to someone who had quietly become capable of offering charity herself. The phone rang Friday morning with a call that surprised me more than any of the others. Pastor Thornfield asked if I would meet with him to discuss what he called a pastoral matter of some complexity. We met in his office that afternoon, a space I had been in several times over the years for routine conversations about church activities and my children's participation in youth programs. But this conversation felt different from the moment I sat down across from his desk. Lena, Pastor Thornfield began, I've been praying about how to respond to your testimony last Sunday, and I have to confess that I'm struggling with some theological questions that your situation raises. I waited for him to continue, curious about what specific aspects of my revelation had challenged his pastoral understanding. For 15 years, he said, our congregation has held up your family as an example of how God provides through community support. We've used your story in sermons about the importance of caring for one another, about how the church can be the hands and feet of Jesus to people in need. He paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he was about to say. But if your circumstances changed years ago, if you achieved financial independence through your own efforts, what does that say about the role of divine provision? What does it say about the importance of community charity? What does it say about the stories we've been telling ourselves about how God works? It was a profound question, one that got to the heart of how communities of faith understand the relationship between divine blessing, personal agency, and mutual support. Pastor Thornfield, I said slowly, I don't think my success invalidates the importance of community charity or divine provision. I think it expands our understanding of how both can work. I leaned forward, trying to articulate thoughts I had been developing for weeks. When my family genuinely needed help, your congregation's support was a clear expression of God's provision through community care. That was real, meaningful, and necessary. But as I grew in capability and success, God's provision began working through my own skills, education, and business development. Both are divine blessing, just expressed differently. Pastor Thornfield nodded thoughtfully. But doesn't that suggest that people who don't achieve financial success lack faith or divine favor? No more than my initial struggles suggested I was spiritually deficient, I replied. Circumstances vary, challenges differ, and God's provision takes many forms. Sometimes it comes through community support, sometimes through personal achievement, sometimes through resources we haven't even considered. We talked for another hour about the theology of success, the complexity of divine blessing, and the danger of creating narratives that limit how God can work in people's lives. Pastor Thornfield was genuinely wrestling with how to integrate my story into his understanding of faith, community, and provision. I think, he said finally, that your testimony challenges us to broaden our understanding of answered prayer. We've been praying for your breakthrough for years, but we defined breakthrough so narrowly that we missed it when it actually occurred. Maybe, I suggested, the lesson isn't about my success specifically. Maybe it's about the importance of really seeing the people we're trying to help, of asking questions instead of making assumptions, of celebrating achievement when it happens instead of only recognizing struggle. Pastor Thornfield was quiet for a long moment. Lena, would you be willing to speak to our deacon board about this? I think your perspective could help us develop better ways of supporting people in our congregation, ways that account for change and growth instead of assuming permanent circumstance. It was an invitation I hadn't expected, an opportunity to help the church develop more nuanced approaches to community support. I agreed to consider it, recognizing that such a conversation could benefit other families whose circumstances might be evolving in ways the congregation hadn't noticed. That weekend, Emma and Tyler came home from their respective colleges to spend a few days processing the dramatic shift that had occurred in our family's relationship with Cedar Grove. Both of them had received calls from church members they had grown up with, people wanting to understand how the family they thought they knew had turned out to be so different from their assumptions. "It's weird," Tyler said as we sat on the back patio Saturday evening. "People keep asking me if I always knew you were successful, as if you had been hiding some secret from everyone, but it wasn't a secret, it was just quiet." Emma nodded in agreement. "I think they expected success to look more dramatic, more obvious. They couldn't see it, because it was gradual and private." We talked about how the revelation had affected their own relationships within the church, how their friends and youth leaders were adjusting to understanding them as children of a successful business owner, rather than recipients of charitable support. "The weird thing," Emma said, "is that some people seem almost disappointed that we don't need help anymore, as if our independence somehow diminishes their purpose." It was an insightful observation, one that captured the complex emotional dynamics that my revelation had created. For some congregation members, our success was genuinely celebratory, proof that their prayers and support had contributed to positive outcomes. For others, our independence threatened their sense of being needed, challenged their role as providers and support. Sunday morning brought another shift in dynamics at church. When we arrived, several people approached us with congratulations rather than offers of assistance. Mrs. Patterson complimented me on the foundation announcement she had seen in the regional newspaper. Deacon Williams asked thoughtful questions about the mill renovation project. The youth pastor mentioned that Tyler's college achievements had been featured in the church newsletter as a success story, rather than a fundraising need. But I also noticed some distance from congregation members who seemed uncertain how to relate to our family now that we were no longer in need of their charity. The comfortable dynamic of helper and helped had been disrupted, leaving some people unsure of how to connect with us. During the service, Pastor Thornfield delivered a sermon about recognizing God's provision in unexpected forms, about the danger of limiting divine blessing to our own preconceptions, about the importance of truly seeing the people around. He didn't mention my family specifically, but the message was clearly informed by our conversation and the broader discussions my revelation had generated. After church, Sister Margaret approached me with a proposition that revealed how quickly some people were adjusting to our new reality. "Lena," she said, "I've been talking with some of the other church ladies about your foundation. We'd like to organize a fundraising event to support the scholarship program, nothing elaborate, maybe a dinner or silent auction. Would you be interested in helping us plan something like that?" It was a complete reversal from 3 weeks earlier, when she had been praying for my family's financial breakthrough. Now she was asking me to help organize fundraising for my own philanthropic initiative. "I'd be happy to discuss it, but I want to make sure that any event we organize respects the dignity of the families who will benefit from the scholarships. I don't want to create the same dynamic of charity and recipient that defined my family's relationship with the church for so many years." Sister Margaret looked thoughtful. "What would that look like?" "It would look like celebrating education and opportunity rather than pitying poverty. It would focus on the potential of scholarship recipients rather than their limitations. It would treat the families we're helping as partners in their own success, rather than passive recipients of other people's generosity." She nodded slowly. "So instead of helping the poor, we'd be investing in the future." "Exactly. Instead of charity, it's partnership. Instead of pity, it's empowerment. As we walked to our car after church, I reflected on how much had changed in just 2 weeks. The congregation was still processing the revelation of my success, still adjusting their understanding of divine blessing and community support, still learning to see me as someone who could contribute rather than someone who needed help. But the transformation was happening, gradually and sometimes awkwardly, as relationships reformed around new realities instead of old assumptions. Some people were embracing the change, celebrating the expansion of their understanding about how God works and how success can manifest. Others were struggling with the disruption of comfortable narratives and familiar roles. The revelation was complete, but the resolution was still unfolding. Each conversation, each adjusted interaction, each new invitation, was part of a larger process of redefining how we related to each other and how we understood the complex dynamics of blessing, provision, and community support. My prayer had been answered in ways the congregation never expected, but their prayers had also been answered, just not in the form they had envisioned. Sometimes the most powerful miracles are the ones that happen so quietly we almost miss them, the ones that challenge our understanding of what divine provision looks like, and how God chooses to work through ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The congregation had prayed for my family's abundance, and their prayers had come true. Now we were all learning what abundance actually looked like when it grew from capability rather than charity, from achievement rather than assistance, from the quiet determination of someone who had been building her own breakthrough while others were still praying for it to happen. 6 months later, I stood in the renovated sanctuary of Cedar Grove Baptist Church, watching Emma receive the first annual Gibson Family Educational Foundation scholarship. The ceremony was nothing like the charity events the church had organized for struggling families in years past. Instead of somber prayers for those less fortunate, the evening celebrated academic achievement, future potential, and the power of education to transform lives. Emma hadn't applied for her own foundation scholarship, of course. She was receiving a special recognition award for her academic excellence and her volunteer work, helping other scholarship recipients navigate the college application process. But watching her stand confidently at the podium, speaking about her goals for graduate school and her plans to return to our community as a teacher, I realized how completely our family's narrative had shifted. No one in that sanctuary was seeing a charity case anymore. They were seeing a young woman of substance, the daughter of a successful entrepreneur, someone whose achievements reflected her own merit rather than her family's limitation. The transformation was complete not just for me but for my children, who had learned to own their accomplishments instead of apologizing for them. The scholarship ceremony had grown beyond anything I had originally envisioned. What started as a private foundation funded with my business success had attracted additional donors throughout the county. Local businesses, civic organizations, and individual families had contributed over $100,000 in additional funding, inspired by the foundation's emphasis on partnership rather than charity. Sister Margaret, who now served as the foundation's volunteer coordinator, had become one of its most effective advocates. Her approach to helping scholarship families was completely different from her old model of church charity. Instead of offering assistance to people she assumed couldn't help themselves, she connected families with resources, mentorship opportunities, and community networks that supported their own efforts toward success. The difference, she had explained to me during one of our monthly foundation meetings, is that we're no longer trying to solve people's problems for them. We're giving them tools to solve their own problems more effectively. It was a profound shift in understanding, one that had gradually influenced how the entire congregation approached community outreach. The food pantry had been restructured to include job training workshops. The clothing ministry had expanded to offer interview preparation and professional wardrobe development. The financial assistance program now required financial literacy education and budgeting support. Cedar Grove was learning to empower rather than enable, to invest in people's potential rather than just addressing their immediate needs. The change hadn't happened overnight, and it hadn't been without resistance from members who preferred the simpler dynamics of giver and receiver. But the results spoke for themselves. Families were achieving independence more quickly, maintaining that independence more successfully, and becoming contributors to the community rather than permanent recipients of aid. My own role in the church had evolved dramatically. I now served on the finance committee, where my business experience helped guide major decisions about church investments and facility improvement. I had been asked to lead a monthly workshop for church members interested in starting their own businesses, sharing practical knowledge about entrepreneurship, financial planning, and professional development. Most significantly, I had been invited to join the pastoral search committee when Pastor Thornfield announced his retirement. The congregation wanted someone with business acumen and community connections to help identify candidates who could lead the church through a period of growth and change. It was a level of trust and respect that would have been unimaginable when I was still categorized as someone who needed help rather than someone who could provide leadership. The mill renovation project had exceeded everyone's expectations, becoming a catalyst for broader downtown revitalization. The Riverside Creative Center was fully occupied within 3 months of opening, housing 12 artist studios, 8 small business offices, a popular cafe, and a community event space that hosted everything from wedding receptions to business conferences. My investment had been returned within 18 months through rental income and property appreciation, but more importantly, the project had created 43 new jobs and generated significant tax revenue for the county. The economic impact had caught the attention of state development officials, who featured the mill renovation in a statewide report about successful public-private partnership. Marcus Thompson and I had parlayed the success of the mill project into a broader development company, specializing in adaptive reuse of historic buildings in small towns throughout the region. We had 3 additional projects in development, each one structured to maximize community benefit, while generating sustainable returns for investors. The consulting business continued to grow as well, now employing 12 people full-time and serving clients in 7 states. We had opened a second office in Charlotte to better serve our expanding North Carolina client base, and I was considering a third location in Atlanta to capture opportunities in the Georgia market. But success, I had learned, was about more than financial growth or business expansion. It was about creating value for other people, building systems that enhanced community well-being, and using resources in ways that multiplied their positive impact. The foundation had awarded scholarships to 38 students in its first year, with a 94% college enrollment rate and an 87% retention rate through the first year of college. More importantly, scholarship families reported feeling supported and empowered rather than dependent, connected to a network of mentors and resources that extended far beyond financial assistance. Emma had become one of the foundation's most effective ambassadors, speaking at high schools throughout the region about college preparation and the importance of pursuing education, regardless of family financial circumstance. Her message was different from typical scholarship presentations, because she spoke from personal experience about both struggle and success, about watching her mother build something substantial through determination and hard work. Tyler had chosen to attend college in-state, partly to stay connected to the foundation's work and partly because he wanted to study business with the goal of eventually joining Gibson Solutions Consulting. His senior project was developing a business plan for expansion into environmental consulting, leveraging growing demand for sustainability expertise among small and medium-sized companies. Both of my children had learned valuable lessons from watching the congregation's reaction to our family's transformation. They understood that success could be invisible if people weren't prepared to see it, that assumptions could persist long after circumstances changed, and that sometimes you had to be willing to disrupt comfortable narratives in order to claim your truth. They had also learned that generosity came in many forms, that community support could evolve from charity to partnership, and that the most meaningful help often involved believing in someone's potential rather than just addressing their immediate need. The theological questions that Pastor Thornfield had wrestled with during our conversations had become the foundation for his final sermon series before retirement. Recognizing God's provision had attracted visitors from other churches and had been requested for publication in the regional denominational newsletter. His central message was that divine blessing often looks different than human expectation, that answered prayers sometimes come through personal agency rather than external intervention,
and that communities of faith must be careful not to limit God's work to their own preconceptions about how provision should manifest. Sometimes, he had preached during one particularly powerful sermon, we pray so hard for God to open doors that we fail to notice when someone has already walked through them. Sometimes we ask so earnestly for breakthrough that we miss the evidence of breakthrough happening quietly around us. The sermon had resonated deeply with the congregation, many of whom were still processing how thoroughly they had misunderstood my family's circumstances for so many years. But rather than dwelling on past blindness, Pastor Thornfield had challenged them to develop better ways of seeing, more nuanced approaches to support, and greater respect for the complexity of other people's lives. His replacement, Reverend Sarah Martinez, brought extensive experience in community development and social justice ministry. She had been attracted to Cedar Grove partly because of the foundation's work and the congregation's evolving approach to empowerment-based outreach. During her interview with the search committee, she had praised the church's willingness to examine its assumptions about poverty and success, to move beyond simple charity models toward more sophisticated approaches to community partnership. Her vision for the church included expanded educational programming, business development, support, and advocacy for policies that created opportunities for economic mobility. The transition in pastoral leadership coincided with a broader transformation in the congregation's identity. Cedar Grove was becoming known throughout the region, not just for its charitable giving, but for its innovative approaches to community development, and its success in helping families achieve long-term independence. Other churches began sending delegations to study the foundation's model and the congregation's restructured outreach programs. The County Social Services Department asked us to help design training programs for their staff about empowerment-based assistance. Regional nonprofit organizations invited me to speak at conferences about sustainable approaches to community investment. What had started as my personal decision to reveal the truth about my success had evolved into a broader movement toward more respectful and effective approaches to helping others. The ripple effects extended far beyond Cedar Grove, influencing how multiple organizations thought about charity, empowerment, and the complex dynamics of giving and receiving help. But perhaps the most significant change was in my own understanding of success and responsibility. Building a profitable business and accumulating personal wealth had been satisfying, but using that success to create opportunities for others was transformative. The foundation, the development projects, the business mentoring, and the policy advocacy work had given my achievements meaning. Beyond personal advancement, I had learned that true abundance wasn't measured only by what you could afford to buy, but by what you could afford to give. Not just financial giving, but the gift of seeing other people's potential, of believing in their capability, of creating systems and opportunities that supported their own efforts toward success. The prayer circle that Sister Margaret had organized 15 years earlier had asked God to provide abundance for my family. Their prayers had been answered, but not in the way they expected and not in the time frame they anticipated. The abundance had come through education, hard work, business development, and strategic investment. It had manifested as the ability to employ others, to fund scholarships, to renovate buildings, and to create lasting value for the entire community. Most importantly, it had included the abundance of being seen accurately, respected appropriately, and valued for actual contributions, rather than pitied for imagined limitations. Standing in that renovated sanctuary, watching young people receive scholarships that would change the trajectory of their lives, I thought about how prayer and action could work together rather than in opposition. The congregation had prayed for my breakthrough while I worked to create it. They had asked for divine provision while I developed the skills and knowledge that would make provision possible. They had requested abundance while I built the business that would generate abundance. Both elements had been necessary. Prayer without action might have left me waiting for change that never came. Action without faith might have been driven by desperation rather than hope. Together they had created a foundation for success that was both spiritually grounded and practically effective. The evening concluded with testimonies from scholarship recipients and their families, stories that echoed my own journey, but reflected the unique circumstances and challenges that each family faced. Some were single parents like I had been, working multiple jobs while pursuing education. Others were facing different obstacles: disability, immigration status, geographic isolation, or family responsibilities that complicated traditional paths to advancement. But all of them shared a common thread: they were not seeking charity that would make them permanently dependent on others' generosity. They were seeking partnership that would enhance their own efforts, tools that would make their work more effective, and opportunities that would allow them to contribute to their communities, rather than just survive within them. As the ceremony ended and people moved to the fellowship hall for refreshments, I was approached by Maria Santos, a young woman whose scholarship had enabled her to pursue nursing education. She was now in her second year of college, maintaining a 7 GPA, while working part-time and sending money home to help support her younger siblings. "Mrs. Gibson," Maria said, "I wanted to thank you not just for the scholarship, but for the way the foundation treats us. I've received help from other organizations, and they always made me feel like I should be grateful for any assistance, like I should accept whatever they offered, without question." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "But your foundation treats us like partners, like people with valuable goals who just need some support to achieve them. It makes me feel capable instead of needy." It was exactly the distinction I had hoped the foundation would embody: the difference between charity that diminished recipients and investment that empowered them. Maria's gratitude wasn't for being rescued from poverty, but for being respected as someone with the intelligence and determination to create her own success. Driving home that evening, I reflected on how completely my life had changed since Sister Margaret's prayer had forced me to confront the gap between perception and reality. The revelation of my success had been dramatic, but the real transformation had happened gradually, through hundreds of small interactions and decisions that rebuilt relationships around truth rather than assumption. I was no longer the struggling single mother who had walked into Cedar Grove Baptist 15 years earlier, but I was also no longer the invisible success story hiding behind other people's charitable assumptions. I had become something more complex and more honest, a woman who had experienced both struggle and achievement, who understood both the need for help and the importance of agency, who could give and receive with equal grace because I knew the value of both. The congregation's prayer for my family's abundance had indeed come true, but abundance had turned out to be more expansive than any of us had imagined. It included financial prosperity, but also the prosperity of being known and respected for who I actually was. It included business success, but also the success of creating opportunities for others. It included personal achievement, but also the achievement of transforming how an entire community understood the relationship between blessing, capability, and divine provision. Sister Margaret had prayed for doors to open that no man could shut. She had been right about the doors, but wrong about who would be opening them. The most important doors had been opened, not by divine intervention, overriding human limitation, but by divine blessing, working through human capability, education, determination, and strategic action. The prayer had been answered, just not in the way anyone expected, and in the end, that had made all the difference. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.